The smell arrived first, not smoke, but something chemical, deliberate, engineered to burn hotter than anything nature could produce. Then came the heat, pressing against faces still wet from seawater drills, and finally the sound, a roar that swallowed orders, prayers, and the rhythm of boots on metal decks. This was not combat, this was training. And for thousands of young sailors across American naval stations between 1942 and 1945, it was the moment they learned that surviving war meant practicing death until it became routine. They called it the fire drill, though that name felt too small for what it demanded. Inside specially constructed training facilities that replicated burning warships, recruits faced controlled infernos designed to simulate the worst moments of naval warfare: oil fires, electrical blazes, ammunition cook-offs, and the suffocating smoke that turned corridors into unmarked graves. The instructors watched from observation posts, timing every movement, noting every hesitation, recording which men froze and which men moved toward the flames, when every instinct screamed to run. The drill was universally despised. Men vomited from heat exhaustion. Some refused to enter the burning compartments and were reassigned or discharged. Others emerged shaking, their hands blistered despite protective gear, their minds replaying the moment the fire roared back after they thought it was extinguished. Yet Naval Command never questioned its necessity. By 1943, American ships were burning in both oceans, torpedoed carriers listing in the Pacific, destroyers split open by kamikaze strikes, cruisers torn apart by magazine explosions that turned steel into shrapnel and men into ash. The statistics were merciless. More sailors died from fire than from the initial attacks that caused them. A single torpedo could sink a ship in minutes, but fire gave men time, terrible, precious time, to either save their vessel or watch it consume them. The difference between survival and catastrophe often came down to seconds. How quickly damage control teams reached the blaze, whether they knew which valves to close, if they remembered their training when smoke blinded them and heat melted their resolve. This is the story of that training. The drill everyone hated, the procedure that felt like punishment, and the moment thousands of young men discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the muscle memory that moved their hands toward flames when their minds had already fled. It is a story without heroes, only survivors who learned that in naval warfare, discipline burns hotter than fire, and repetition is the only defense against chaos. Before we continue, subscribe and turn on the bell. Here we tell real untold stories of World War II, stories of training, survival, and the brutal lessons that turned ordinary men into damage control teams who could face an inferno and see only procedure. Chapter 1. The Facility, 850-950 words. The training facility stood apart from the main barracks, close enough to hear but far enough that the screaming didn't carry during evening mess. It was a structure built specifically to burn. A replica destroyer section constructed from salvaged steel, welded together with deliberate weaknesses that allowed instructors to flood compartments with burning oil, ignite electrical panels, or simulate ammunition fires that sent trainee hearts into their throats. The Navy had built dozens of these facilities across coastal stations, each one a monument to lessons learned in blood across the Pacific and Atlantic theaters. New recruits saw it during their first week, pointed out by instructors with the casual tone reserved for warnings everyone ignores. That's where you'll learn to fight fire, they were told, as if fire were an opponent that could be studied, anticipated, defeated through proper technique. Most recruits nodded, their minds still processing boot camp exhaustion, uniforms that didn't fit, and homesickness that arrived in waves during night watches. The facility looked ordinary from outside, just another gray building in a compound full of gray buildings. They had no context yet for what waited inside. The preparation began with classroom instruction that felt surreal in its clinical detail. Instructors diagrammed ship compartments on blackboards, marking fuel lines, electrical conduits, ammunition storage, and ventilation systems with the precision of anatomists mapping organs. They explained fire behavior with scientific detachment, how flames spread through oxygen-rich environments, how smoke killed before heat, how certain materials, rubber, paint, insulation, produced toxic gases that incapacitated men before they realized they were poisoned. The recruits took notes mechanically, their handwriting gradually degrading as instructors described real incidents. The carrier where fire spread so quickly that men trapped below decks had to choose between burning or drowning when they opened hatches to escape. The destroyer, where a single electrical fire cascaded through 3 decks because damage control teams didn't know which circuit breakers to pull. The cruiser, where ammunition cooked off for 18 hours, each explosion killing the firefighters who thought the previous blast was the last. Between lectures came equipment drills, endless repetition of donning breathing apparatus, connecting fire hoses, operating foam dispensers, and coordinating team movements through smoke-filled corridors. The instructors demanded speed without panic, precision without thought. "You won't have time to remember," they repeated. "Your hands need to know before your brain does." So the recruits practiced until their fingers found valve wheels in darkness, until they could distinguish water pressure by sound alone, until the weight of breathing tanks felt natural against their spines. Then came the demonstration. The entire training company assembled outside the facility on a morning when wind carried smoke out to sea. Instructors in full protective gear entered through the main hatch, their movements visible through observation windows cut into the steel walls. Inside, controlled fires had been set. Small blazes at first, contained in metal drums, producing more smoke than flame. The watching recruits saw their instructors advance methodically, directing water streams with practiced precision, coordinating without apparent communication. The fires escalated. Oil ignited in spreading pools. Electrical panels sparked and flashed. The instructors' movements never changed. The same deliberate pace, the same coordinated positions, the same procedural responses. Watching from outside, the recruits understood intellectually what they were seeing, but understanding and believing were different things. How could men move that calmly toward flames that licked up walls and across ceilings? How could they stand in compartments where heat made air shimmer and breathe as if they were washing dishes? The demonstration ended with all fires extinguished, all hazards secured, all systems checked and rechecked. The instructors emerged, their gear blackened but intact, their breathing elevated but controlled. They gathered the recruits close enough to smell smoke on their clothes, and delivered the message that would echo through every subsequent drill. Fire doesn't care about your fear. It only responds to procedure. Learn the procedure until fear becomes irrelevant. That night in the barracks, the recruits who had watched the demonstration struggled to sleep. Some lay awake, calculating how many days remained until their turn inside the facility. Others tried to convince themselves that the demonstration had been staged, that real fires couldn't be that intense, that training wouldn't actually replicate combat conditions. A few wrote letters home describing the facility in vague terms, unable to articulate the specific dread that had settled in their chests. The instructors knew this fear intimately. They had felt it themselves during their own training, had carried it through combat deployments where demonstration became reality, where procedure meant the difference between bringing their ships home or watching them slip beneath waves. They never mentioned this to recruits. Fear, they understood, was a private burden. What mattered was whether that fear paralyzed or motivated, whether it made men flee or made them practice harder. Outside the facility, maintenance crews prepared for the next day's training cycle. They refilled fuel tanks, tested ignition systems, inspected breathing apparatus, and replaced damaged panels. The facility would burn again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until war's end. Each controlled fire a rehearsal for the moment when procedure would be tested by chaos, when muscle memory would fight against panic, and when young sailors would discover whether hatred of the drill had taught them enough to survive the real thing. Chapter 2. The first entry, 850-950 words. The morning arrived with mechanical inevitability. Roll call at 0500. Breakfast consumed without appetite. Equipment inspection conducted in silence, punctuated only by the clicking of buckles and the hiss of breathing apparatus being tested. The recruits stood in formation outside the facility, their protective gear making them appear larger than they felt, their faces visible through clear masks that would soon fog with exertion and fear. The lead instructor addressed them without ceremony. You will enter in teams of 4. You will advance to the fire. You will execute the procedures you've learned. You will not panic because panic kills faster than flames. If you freeze, we will pull you out. If you refuse to enter, you will be reassigned. Questions? There were no questions. What could they ask that would make this easier? The first team entered while the others watched through observation windows. Inside, the facility's lighting had been reduced to simulate combat conditions. Emergency lanterns casting red shadows, smoke obscuring the ceiling, visibility dropping to arm's length within seconds. The flames started small, burning in controlled drums positioned throughout the compartment, their heat already building against the metal walls. The watching recruits saw their teammates hesitate at the threshold, where cool air met furnace heat. That hesitation lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but it felt eternal. Then training overrode instinct, and hands reached for hose couplings. Feet advanced toward the flames, and voices began calling out positions and pressures, using the standardized phrases drilled into memory. The procedure was unfolding exactly as taught, yet everything about it seemed wrong. Too hot, too loud, too real. Inside, the first team discovered that demonstration and participation were entirely different experiences. The heat didn't just warm skin. It penetrated through protective gear, making breath shallow and muscles heavy. The smoke didn't just obscure vision. It transformed the familiar compartment into alien geography, where walls appeared and disappeared, where distances became impossible to judge, where up and down lost meaning. The fire didn't just burn, it roared with animal fury, retreating under water pressure only to surge back when attention shifted elsewhere. One recruit froze. His hand stopped moving mid-procedure. His body locked in place while his mind spiraled through calculations of how quickly fire spreads, how much oxygen remained, how many steps back to the exit. The instructor's voice cut through his paralysis. Move or exit. Decide now. The recruit forced his hands back to the hose, forced his feet forward, forced procedure to override the screaming certainty that he was about to die in a training exercise. The team extinguished their assigned fires according to protocol. They closed valves in the correct sequence, verified that hotspots had been eliminated, and backed out of the compartment, maintaining visual contact with potential reignition points. The entire evolution lasted 12 minutes. When they emerged into daylight, several immediately removed their masks and vomited. Others sat heavily on the ground, their hands shaking with adrenaline crash. One recruit wept quietly, not from injury but from the sheer exhaustion of fighting his own nervous system for 12 minutes straight. The instructor offered no comfort, only observation. You hesitated at entry. You will hesitate less next time. You forgot to announce pressure readings. You will remember next time you completed the procedure. That is enough for day one. Then he called the next team forward, and the cycle continued. Throughout the morning, team after team entered the facility. Some performed better than others, but all emerged changed. The difference was subtle but fundamental. They had moved toward fire when everything human said to run. They had forced hands to continue working when heat made skin tingle with warning signals. They had trusted procedure over instinct, and procedure had kept them alive. That trust was still fragile, still required conscious effort, but it had been established. Between rotations, recruits compared experiences with the desperate intensity of soldiers sharing combat stories. They described the exact moment heat became unbearable, the specific sound flames made when water struck them, the way smoke obscured their teammates until only voices confirmed their presence. These conversations served a purpose beyond camaraderie. By articulating fear, they made it manageable. By identifying specific challenges, they transformed overwhelming dread into discrete problems that could be solved through better technique. The instructors listened to these conversations without participating. They knew that recruits needed to process the experience in their own words, to convince themselves that what they'd accomplished was survivable. Later would come the technical debriefing, the identification of procedural errors, the planning for improved performance. For now, letting men talk served as its own form of training. The understanding that fear shared was fear diminished, that every sailor in that facility felt the same doubts, faced the same challenges, survived the same drill. Now tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and how far these forgotten wartime stories have reached. Your voice helps keep memory alive. By afternoon, every recruit had completed at least one entry. Some had performed well enough to go twice. Others had been pulled out mid-procedure, their fear having crossed from manageable to dangerous. The instructors made notes, tracking which men showed promise and which required additional attention. There were no failures on day one, only baselines established. Tomorrow the fires would burn hotter, the scenarios would grow more complex, and the drill everyone hated would continue its methodical work of transforming sailors into damage control teams, capable of facing hell with procedure manuals. Chapter 3. De-escalation. 850-950 words. The second week introduced scenarios that made the first week seem like practice for practice. The instructors no longer announced what type of fire awaited inside the facility. Teams entered blind, forced to assess conditions and select appropriate responses while heat built and smoke thickened. Oil fires that couldn't be fought with water. Electrical blazes that required cutting power while flames spread. Combination scenarios where one fire threatened to ignite another. where procedure demanded splitting attention between multiple threats, where every decision carried cascading consequences. The recruits learned that fighting fire aboard ship was fundamentally different from civilian firefighting. On land, firefighters could retreat, regroup, request additional resources, or evacuate and let structures burn. At sea, retreat meant abandoning your ship. Regrouping meant coordinating in spaces already compromised, and letting it burn meant sinking. The instructors hammered this reality through repetition. Your ship is your only refuge. If it burns, you drown. There is no calling for help. You are the help. New equipment entered the training rotation. Breathing apparatus with limited air supplies, forcing teams to monitor time while executing procedures, communication systems that failed or became unreliable in high heat, requiring hand signals and physical contact to coordinate, damage control equipment that malfunctioned deliberately, teaching improvisation when standard tools proved inadequate. Each addition increased complexity, pushing recruits further from comfortable competence into the chaos that defined actual combat damage control. The facility itself evolved to match this escalation. Instructors introduced darkness beyond what emergency lighting provided, forcing navigation by touch and memory. They added acoustic chaos, simulated explosions, the shriek of damaged metal, the roar of compromised ventilation systems that made communication nearly impossible. They manipulated temperature extremes, creating pockets of superheated air that appeared without warning, teaching situational awareness through painful experience. Injuries became routine despite safety protocols, burns that blistered hands even through gloves, smoke inhalation that sent recruits to medical for oxygen and observation, heat exhaustion that dropped men mid-procedure, forcing their teammates to drag them to safety while maintaining fire suppression. The instructors treated these injuries as data points rather than failures, documentation of what happened when procedure broke down, when protective equipment reached its limits, when human physiology confronted physics. The psychological toll exceeded the physical. Recruits began having nightmares about fire, waking to phantom smells of smoke, flinching at sudden heat sources during routine activities. Some developed anticipatory anxiety that built throughout each day, their hands shaking hours before entering the facility. Others experienced emotional numbness, executing procedures with mechanical precision while their minds retreated to safer internal spaces. The instructors recognized these responses as normal, but offered no counseling, no reassurance beyond repetition. The drill continued. A particular scenario broke several recruits simultaneously. The team entered what appeared to be a standard oil fire drill, but midway through suppression, instructors ignited a secondary blaze in an adjacent compartment. The new fire cut off their planned exit route, forcing immediate decision-making under conditions that triggered every panic response human evolution had developed. 2 recruits froze completely. A third dropped his hose and ran for the secondary exit, abandoning procedure and teammates. The fourth maintained position, continuing suppression alone until instructors intervened. The debriefing after that scenario was brutal in its honesty. The instructor addressed the recruit who had fled. "You ran. That's human. But at sea, running from fire often means running into fire. There's nowhere to run except overboard, and the ocean kills as surely as flames. If you cannot train yourself to stand, you cannot serve on a ship." The recruit was reassigned the following day. The others watched him pack his gear in silence, each man privately questioning whether they would have run given the same circumstances. Yet the training produced measurable improvement. Response times decreased. Procedural errors diminished. Teams began anticipating complications rather than merely reacting to them. The recruits who remained developed something beyond competence, a cold operational mindset that assessed fire as a problem set rather than a threat. They stopped seeing flames as inherently dangerous and started seeing them as chemical reactions that followed predictable rules that could be exploited through proper technique. The instructors noted this transition with professional satisfaction. They understood that they were not teaching bravery, which was unreliable and individual, but procedure, which was consistent and transferable. A brave man might charge into fire once. A trained man would enter fire repeatedly, methodically as many times as his ship required, because procedure told him exactly what to do and his hands knew how to do it without consulting his fear. Between drills, the recruits formed bonds stronger than typical military camaraderie. They had seen each other at their worst, paralyzed, panicking, failing, and their best, pushing through fear, covering for teammates, executing procedures while every instinct screamed retreat. These bonds were forged not in triumph, but in shared suffering, in the collective understanding that they were being prepared for scenarios where procedure would be the only defense against chaos that could kill entire crews. The facility burned daily, each fire a controlled lesson, each lesson incrementally harder than the last. The drill everyone hated continued its methodical work, grinding down panic through repetition, replacing instinct with training, building muscle memory strong enough to override survival responses. And the recruits, whether they admitted it or not, were beginning to understand why the Navy insisted on this brutal preparation. They were learning to turn a firestorm into procedure. Chapter 4. The Night Evolution. 850, 950 words. The announcement came without warning during evening formation. Tonight's drill will begin at 0200, full gear, total darkness. This is not optional. The recruits returned to barracks knowing sleep would be impossible, their minds already racing through scenarios, their bodies already tensing against anticipated heat. The instructors had been building toward this deliberately, pushing training later into evenings, reducing lighting incrementally, preparing nervous systems for the moment when darkness and fire would combine into something qualitatively worse than either alone. At 01:45, the recruits assembled outside the facility under a moonless sky. The structure loomed black against black, its observation windows covered, its interior invisible. No emergency lighting would be provided. Navigation would rely entirely on memory, touch, and whatever illumination the fires themselves provided. The instructors explained the scenario in voices that carried clearly through pre-dawn silence. Electrical fire has knocked out ship's lighting. Emergency systems are compromised. You will enter, locate the fire, and suppress it using only the equipment you carry and the training you've received. Time begins when you enter. The first team approached the facility entrance with movement slowed by darkness and dread. Their helmet lamps provided narrow cones of visibility that revealed nothing beyond immediate obstacles. When they crossed the threshold, even that limited light seemed to vanish, absorbed by smoke that had been building in the compartment for hours. The familiar space became alien territory where walls appeared unexpectedly, where floor and ceiling lost distinction, where orientation dissolved within seconds. Inside, the fire announced itself through heat before light. The team felt it building ahead of them, a pressure against exposed skin, a warning that grew stronger with each forward step. Then they saw it, not the controlled drum fires of early training, but a spreading blaze that had been allowed to develop naturally, consuming whatever fuel the instructors had provided, creating the kind of scenario that occurred on damaged ships where initial fires went unchecked while crews dealt with flooding, casualties, or structural damage. The darkness transformed fire from opponent into environment. Light came only from flames, casting wild shadows that moved independent of any actual threat, creating phantom fires in peripheral vision, making depth perception impossible. The recruits advanced by feel, their hands finding walls, their feet testing deck plates, their voices calling out positions to teammates they couldn't see. Procedure became tactile rather than visual, finding valve wheels by shape, connecting hoses by touch, aiming water streams toward heat sources rather than visible flames. Communication collapsed under the combined assault of darkness, smoke, and fire roar. The standardized calls that worked perfectly in daylight became meaningless when team members couldn't see who was speaking or what they were referencing. The recruits adapted instinctively, grabbing shoulders to confirm presence, using physical pressure to direct attention, developing nonverbal coordination born from desperation and shared confusion. One team became disoriented completely. They advanced confidently toward the fire, suppressed it according to procedure, then turned to exit and discovered that darkness had erased their mental map. The compartment that they'd navigated dozens of times in daylight became a maze of identical metal walls. Panic began its familiar rise, the certainty that they were lost, that smoke would overcome them, that they would die within yards of safety. The team leader forced procedure. Stop, breathe, think, move deliberately. They backtracked using the fire hose as a guideline, following it hand over hand until they found the entrance. The instructors watched through infrared equipment that turned the scene into a ghostly green tableau. They saw teams split apart and struggle to reunite. They watched recruits freeze when darkness made orientation impossible. They noted which men maintained procedure despite sensory deprivation and which abandoned training in favor of instinct. Every observation was recorded, every mistake documented, Every success measured against the standard of whether this team could save a burning ship at night, when exhaustion and fear had already depleted their reserves. Between rotations, recruits who had completed the drill tried to describe the experience to those still waiting. Their explanations fell short, reduced to fragments. You can't see anything. The heat comes from everywhere. You forget which way is out. These inadequate warnings did nothing to prepare subsequent teams, who entered the facility carrying the same false confidence that darkness would merely add difficulty rather than fundamentally transforming the nature of the challenge. By 0400, every team had completed at least one night evolution. Some had performed adequately. Others had required instructor intervention to prevent genuine injury or loss of equipment. A few had excelled, moving through darkness with efficiency that suggested they'd internalized procedure to the point where visual confirmation became unnecessary. The instructors gathered these observations, identifying which recruits showed promise for advanced training and which needed additional drilling before they could be trusted in actual combat scenarios. The recruits returned to barracks as dawn began breaking over the naval station. They stripped off smoke-saturated gear, showered in silence, and collapsed into bunks without conversation. Sleep came quickly, but brought no rest. Their minds replayed the night evolution endlessly, analyzing mistakes, calculating how close they'd come to failure, wondering whether they could repeat the performance if called upon at sea. The drill had accomplished its purpose, teaching them that fire didn't wait for convenient conditions, that damage control happened in darkness and chaos, and that procedure remained their only reliable defense when every sensory input screamed that they were lost. Chapter 5. The Casualty Scenario, 850-950 words. The next phase of training introduced the element that transformed abstract procedure into visceral reality: casualties. Not simulated injuries marked with cards or announced through speakers, but instructors and volunteers acting as wounded sailors who screamed convincingly, bled from makeup wounds, and became physical burdens that teams had to manage while simultaneously fighting fires. The addition was deliberate. Combat damage control rarely happened in isolation. Ships burned while men died, and effective teams had to execute procedures while their shipmates suffered within arm's reach. The scenario began without warning. A team entered the facility for what they assumed was a standard suppression drill, but seconds after crossing the threshold, they encountered their first casualty: an instructor lying motionless near the fire, his uniform charred, his breathing shallow and labored. The team hesitated, their training suddenly fragmenting into competing priorities: suppress the fire or save the man, split the team or maintain unit integrity, follow procedure or respond to immediate human need. The team leader made a decision. 2 men would continue fire suppression, while 2 evacuated the casualty. It seemed logical, a compromise between competing demands. But the fire grew, while team strength diminished. The casualty fought evacuation, his role requiring him to simulate disorientation and panic. And the remaining firefighters discovered that 2 men couldn't execute procedures designed for 4-man teams. The scenario spiraled toward failure until instructors intervened, calling a halt and gathering everyone for immediate debriefing. Fire kills faster than injuries, the lead instructor stated flatly. That man would have survived another 60 seconds. Your ship will not. Suppress the fire first, always, then handle casualties. If you reverse that priority, everyone dies together. The team absorbed this brutal calculus in silence, each man privately reconciling the instruction with his own sense of morality and mutual responsibility. Subsequent scenarios enforced this hierarchy with methodical cruelty. Teams encountered casualties blocking critical pathways, forcing decisions about whether to move injured men or work around them. They found wounded sailors in compartments that needed to be sealed to prevent fire spread, creating impossible choices between individual survival and ship preservation. They faced situations where helping casualties required abandoning suppression equipment, where evacuation routes became blocked with injured personnel, where the screaming of wounded men competed with fire's roar for attention and resources. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Recruits who had mastered fire suppression began making errors when casualties entered scenarios. Their focus splintered between procedure and human suffering. Their movements became rushed, trading methodical precision for speed, driven by guilt and empathy. The instructors documented these failures without judgment, then required teams to repeat scenarios until procedure reasserted itself, until recruits learned to execute fire suppression while simultaneously cataloging casualties for later evacuation, until they could maintain operational focus despite screaming that would haunt their sleep. Some recruits couldn't make the adjustment. They hesitated too long over casualties, their training colliding with basic human empathy. They argued with instructors about priorities, insisting that injured men required immediate attention regardless of fire conditions. These arguments were met with cold statistics. Percentages of ships lost because fire consumed them, while crews focused on casualties. Casualty counts from fires that could have been suppressed if teams had maintained procedural discipline. Survivor testimonies describing watching their ships burn because initial damage control responses prioritized saving individuals over saving vessels. The training introduced another layer. Recruits themselves became casualties on rotation. Each man spent time playing wounded, learning what it felt like to be bypassed by teammates focused on fire suppression, experiencing the terror of being trapped in a burning compartment while help moved past toward other priorities. This perspective was deliberately cultivating. Understanding casualty experience made recruits better at managing them, at distinguishing genuinely critical injuries from those that could wait, at communicating triage decisions under conditions where explanation was impossible. If this story has moved you, leave a like. It helps others discover how humanity can survive even inside the walls of captivity. Medical personnel joined training rotations, teaching rapid assessment techniques that could be executed while wearing full protective gear in smoke-obscured compartments. Recruits learned to check vitals by touch, to identify immediately life-threatening conditions, to mark casualties for evacuation priority using standardized signals that would be understood by any rescuer. They practiced dragging unconscious bodies through hatches designed for single-file passage, moving injured sailors down vertical ladders, evacuating casualties through smoke-filled passages while maintaining their own safety. The scenarios grew progressively more complex, combining multiple casualties with escalating fire conditions. Teams entered compartments where fire blocked casualty locations, requiring suppression before rescue became possible. They faced situations where evacuating casualties required breaking procedure, deviating from standard routes, making real-time decisions about risk versus benefit. They learned that damage control was not procedural or humanitarian. It was procedural and humanitarian, with success requiring the mental flexibility to shift between priorities based on constantly changing conditions. Between drills, recruits processed these lessons with subdued conversation. The early training bravado had vanished, replaced by sober recognition of what they were being prepared for. They understood now that serving aboard warships meant making decisions where all outcomes included loss, where following procedure might mean watching men die, where the only measure of success was whether more survived than would have otherwise. This understanding aged them in ways unrelated to calendar time, creating a gravity that marked them even among other military personnel who hadn't experienced equivalent training. The instructors recognized this transformation as necessary. They were not training heroes who would rush into flames to save individual lives at any cost. They were training damage control teams who could execute procedures while men died, who could maintain operational focus despite emotional devastation, who could keep their ships afloat through disciplined response to chaos that would paralyze untrained personnel. The drill everyone hated had become the drill that taught survival through calculated detachment, teaching sailors to turn even human tragedy into procedure. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. 850-950 words. Every training cycle reached a moment where the accumulated stress exceeded human capacity for adaptation. The instructors called it the wall, the point where physical exhaustion, emotional depletion, and psychological pressure converged to break even the most motivated recruits. The facility had been designed with this breaking point in mind, its scenarios calibrated to push men past their perceived limits, to identify who would crack under pressure and who would discover reserves they didn't know existed. The scenario that typically triggered collapse combined every learned stress into a single evolution. Teams entered the facility to find multiple fires burning in connected compartments, casualties blocking critical passages, communication systems deliberately failed, and time pressure imposed through simulated flooding or structural failure. The fires weren't optional training burns. They were fully developed blazes that required perfect procedure to suppress. The casualties weren't quiet victims. They screamed, fought evacuation, and created realistic chaos. The time pressure wasn't abstract. Instructors announced updates that made remaining time explicit and final. One recruit broke spectacularly during such a scenario. He entered the facility with his team, advanced toward the fire according to procedure, encountered a casualty blocking their path and suddenly stopped functioning, not freezing in place, but something deeper, a complete cognitive shutdown, where his body remained present, but his mind had evacuated. His teammates tried to move him, shouting encouragement and commands, but he stood motionless, eyes open but unseeing, hands slack at his sides. Instructors pulled him out and he walked to the exit mechanically, then collapsed outside and wept with deep, racking sobs that suggested something fundamental had broken. The medical team evaluated him for physical injury, found none, and cleared him to return to barracks. The psychological evaluation came later, conducted by officers trained to distinguish temporary breakdown from permanent unsuitability. The recruit described his experience in fragments: the certainty that he was going to die, the absolute conviction that procedure was meaningless against chaos this complete, the sudden inability to remember any training, the sensation of his mind simply refusing to process additional input. He was reassigned within 24 hours, transferred to duties that wouldn't require damage control responsibilities. His departure affected the remaining recruits profoundly. They had witnessed that breakdown, had seen one of their own reduced to non-function by conditions they would all face again. Some began questioning whether they would similarly collapse when pushed beyond their limits. Others hardened their resolve, determined to prove they possessed whatever quality the broken recruit had lacked. The instructors allowed these concerns to simmer without addressing them directly. Fear of breaking, they understood, motivated most men more effectively than speeches about duty or capability. The facility claimed casualties through other mechanisms as well. Injuries that exceeded the threshold for continued training, severe burns that required extended recovery, smoke inhalation that compromised respiratory function, heat exhaustion that caused temporary organ stress. Each injured recruit departed with documentation that would affect his service assignment, marking him as unsuitable for ships where fire damage control was critical. Some accepted these reassignments with relief. Others fought the designation, requesting to repeat training once healed, unwilling to accept that their bodies had proven inadequate to demands their minds had been willing to meet.